Hi, this is Adam.
And this is not Dave. This
What?
is Erica.
Erica's here. Yay!
Yay!
For a very special edition of fiction
And nonfiction.
or nonfiction.
Or nonfiction. I'm already been fired. Okay.
It's okay. Cue music while I give her the pink slip.
Or non-fiction.
Hey, so this is the show where we go through viral news stories. We look at popular stories spread amongst the internet, look at urban legends, and determine whether these stories are true or false, if they happen to be fiction or
Nonfiction.
nonfiction, exactly. And Erica, you are kind of an amateurish expert on the subject we're going to talk about today. I do want to give a little bit of background because some people may be like, "Where's Dave?" And I have to go, "Dave's not here, man." Well, reason being, David is, to quote him, "I'm too scared and I don't want to do this episode with you." So luckily, Erica is brave enough to traverse the world
I'm really
with me.
sure he's going to appreciate you telling everybody that too.
I will put that on his
okay.
employee evaluation.
It's not the Ouija board. I'm going to say that right now.
No, this is even better. We are looking at tarot, or as David pronounced it, tarot.
Yes. I've noticed a few people pronounce it like that.
Well, it's, I can see it's phonetic because it is spelled Tarot, and I should spell it just for people who may not be familiar. Tarot is a pack of playing cards that has, over the years, been adapted to be a form of fortune telling, affirmation prompts, and really using these cards to perform cartomancy, which we'll explain as the episode goes on. And as you can probably suspect what's going to happen here, my whole thing is going to be looking into the history of this, either debunking or verifying something valid about the history of the supposed ability for these cards to perform cartomancy. But I have Erica here for a very particular reason, because you've actually recently taken up the art of tarot.
This is true. This is something that I've always wanted to learn to do. I have a very good friend that has read my tarot cards. I have people in my world that read tarot cards, and I've wanted to learn how to do it. So I would say I'm not nowhere near an expert, but I'm definitely a very amateur, curious person. I'm tarot curious. Is that a
Tarot curious? I
tarot
like that.
Curious. So I'm very, very new at this, and I think that's part of the reason I'm glad I'm here today, because I don't want people who are curious as well to be scared, aka Dave, to pick up. They are playing cards. They are simply cards. They're just things to play around with, and if you want to go more spiritual with it and more enlightening with it, you can choose to do that. The idea is they're some sort of fun guidance and a synchronicity creator, if you want to call them that.
Mm-hmm. And in that way, what we're going to do later on in this episode is actually perform a tarot reading. So we're going to see how these work, basically for a standard method of reading the cards. Erica's going to help me with that. And we have a great selection of tarot decks in front of you. And this is the good thing for a lot of people. There are traditional decks like the Smith-Waite deck. That's a very standardized one. But there have been so many artist-created and bespoke decks. You have a number of them ranging from dog tarot to Stranger Things.
Yes, Stranger Things is my favorite. I will say that. It's very nostalgic for the 80s. I have a Halloween deck. I have a beginner deck that I picked up at Smudge, which is the metaphysical shop in Walkerville. Mm-hmm. And then I have what was once called or more commonly referred to as the Rider-Waite tarot deck, which is the original quote-unquote tarot deck, but is now been renamed the Smith-Waite tarot deck because it never properly gave recognition to the woman who created the images, Pamela Coleman Smith. So I purposely sought out the Smith-Waite version of it so that her artistry was acknowledged.
And of course, this is also a thing that people are collecting now. So sometimes people will have huge collections of various tarot decks because of the incredible artwork, the attention to detail. And I will say, off the cuff of this episode, I appreciate the artistry of so many of these illustrations. I think people are able to get creative. Sometimes the illustrations in the decks are funny. Sometimes they come across as profound. Sometimes they come across as a great niche extension of an interest. Maybe you're a fan of Stranger Things, or maybe you're a fan of Doctor Who. There are decks for all of that.
Absolutely. Yes, there's pretty much any character, any like genre. There's a deck associated with it, and I've come to learn that at least my understanding of it is you don't necessarily have to be given a deck. There's sort of this myth that you can't buy your own deck. I was only gifted one of these and I bought the rest. And anyone who I know who does tarot regularly says, oh, that's just bunk. Just pick your deck. Mm-hmm. The idea that I've come across is that when you actually go to do a reading or do interaction with someone with the cards, is have them pick the deck that they feel is most responding to them. Because the interaction is not about you as the person interpreting the cards. It's more about the person who is experiencing the cards.
And I think as we get into this conversation, we're going to explore both sides of readings. Those who legitimately believe that this is a form of fortune telling or some sort of indication of the state of your world, and then others who take it as almost a affirmation prompt.
Absolutely.
And maybe even a cue for self actualization, but we'll get into that a little bit more later on.
I am ready for this ride.
Oh, right. So, Erica, before we get going too much forward, in terms of the very origin of the tarot deck and the tarot card, do you know much about its history?
I don't know. I didn't take the deep dive you did, but there's a very good podcast out there called Haunted Objects by Greg and Dana Newkirk. And they did their first episode this season was a deep dive into the history of tarot. And I've listened to it a couple times, and it basically goes back to these, I think it's 15th, 16th century. These were originally playing cards. These were like the minor arcana is the same as your traditional deck of cards with the spades. Instead, they're like pentacles, they're wands, they're swords, and they're cups. Mm-hmm. And we've renamed them obviously to spades and hearts and diamonds and
these various suits. Yes.
Yeah, exactly. So essentially, at its bare bones, these were playing cards, and they sort of manifested. I'll use this word that usually comes with tarot into more of a, like you said, a fortune teller or a more spiritual like game. Mm-hmm. But that's why I don't think people should be scared or nervous about these, because it's essentially it is a form of a game. I trust tarot more than I trust a psychic. So because the idea is you're interacting and you take with it what you want. If you think it's absolute bunk, then that's totally fine. If something happens, because I've read tarot with people, I've had my tarot read, and years later I'd go back, I'd take notes. It's almost spot on, but that question comes back to, and we obviously will go into this more in depth, goes back to is that sort of confirmation bias of me going, oh, okay, yeah, like 2 years ago, this is what was told to me, and I can fit the pieces now. Mm-hmm. Or did I manifest it based on what the cards, quote unquote, were telling me?
And I think that's a very interesting aspect to get into the history of this based upon, and we will be touching upon confirmation bias, we'll be touching upon the legitimacy of this as a form of cartomancy, and we'll explain exactly what the heck cartomancy is.
Absolutely.
It's pretty much exactly what it sounds like, but let's talk about the history of tarot a little bit. Yeah. Tarot, of course, is a pack of playing cards, or at least originated as that, and the records that we've found and that most scholars identify go back to at least the mid-15th century in various parts of Europe, but primarily around Italy. Mm-hmm. And it goes back to kind of proto-tarot playing cards called tarocchini. Mm. So this really comes from Italian roots, where tarot playing cards spread throughout Europe after this popularization of it, and it evolved into a family of games that includes the German Gross Tarot, and modern games such as the French Tarot and Austrian Königrufen. And I'm sure I'm mispronouncing that. My apologies to our Austrian listeners out there. But the main thing that switched over took place in the 18th century, and I think this is where most North Americans who hear of tarot will make the association with it relating to cartomancy or fortune telling.
Right.
Because by the late 18th century, French occultists started making claims about the history and meaning of the cards. Now, these claims include tying tarot back to ancient Egypt, the Book of Thoth, as designed by Aleister Crowley, who is a name we're going to be returning to, and also the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, a secret society of occult practitioners who formed in the 19th century. So basically, they were making claims that the symbolism, that the iconography and imagery dates back to these ancient practices, these ancient texts, and can be used to divine either fortune or be able to see, I guess you could say not even see, but manipulate events going forward. So that's basically the gist of where tarot has its roots in fortune telling. What do you make of these connections that the Golden Dawn and that Aleister Crowley made of the tarot deck going back to ancient Egypt?
I mean, there's I think you also have to look at the time period. 18th century Victorian England, very big in the spiritual realm of things. That's when spirituality and, you know, the seances and what happens after you die, that really became forefront in the late 1800s during the late Victorian period. That's where you get those ghost photos where people, you know, claim that the spirit of the person, and I believe it was just double exposure, right?
But
So,
even then, like, seances were part of,
absolutely.
like, popular parlor, I don't even want to say games, but parlor events where people would gather.
Absolutely, and it gave women a forefront in the job market because a lot of women were the ones making money doing these things. So I think it really took off then. With the connection to Egypt, I have heard that too. It's all imagery. Like, Egyptian hieroglyphs are all imagery. So it comes back to, what do those images mean to the people living during that time? And essentially that's what these cards are. There's very few words on the cards. It's all images. And so how you interpret those images is at the heart of what tarot is and interpreting tarot.
So I had this conversation, maybe a debate one time with a coworker of mine. I just assumed people knew who Aleister Crowley was.
Yep.
Who is Aleister Crowley?
Honestly, I know he was a researcher. I just cannot. I've heard this name many times, so I'm going to need you're going to explain it to the audience anyway. So
I'm just going to give the
I
very
feel like as soon as you say the next two sentences, I'll be like, oh yeah, that's who it is.
Cliff Notes version. Basically, Aleister Crowley was a self-purported magician who was someone who researched and practiced occult practices. Throughout his storied career, he developed quite the following, and he was also someone who appropriated iconography from what would be seen as either occult or Satanist sects and texts, and appropriated them into this cult-like following. Now, it should be noted, through historical records, through investigation, all this was complete fabrication. Aleister Crowley should be known for little more than being an incredible hoax and an incredible scam artist throughout his career. He took seemingly disparate imagery and iconography from various religions across the world and made this hodgepodge that attracted a lot of people. He certainly was very charismatic, and I think, like a lot of people who start cults, that was his biggest draw. But ultimately, everything that he proposed and purported was debunked. Aside from this is one of the main things that people continue to believe. Not all his iterations of what tarot was and how it had roots in ancient Egypt, but his beliefs in this and its connection with this ancient book of Thoth is something that has survived over the years.
Right.
So that's really the connection with Aleister Crowley with all of this.
Yep. I mean, now that you say that, I am picturing connections here. I think he was linked, or not linked, but probably brought up in conversations with Ed and Lorraine Warren about whether or not they were legitimate as well.
Absolutely. And he was also, let me just state this before everyone goes, oh, poor Aleister Crowley, maybe he was misunderstood. He was not a nice guy.
Yeah.
He was a predator. He was someone who manipulated a lot of people, both financially, physically, and he had a lot of gains made in his life at the exploitation of others. So let's not shed a tear for Mr. Crowley here. Oh, wow, I just made a great song there. But we'll talk a little bit more about the history, because I think, let's look at what we can actually glean from the oldest records of tarot. As we've established, it goes back to at least the mid-15th century. The first documented tarot decks actually emerged, scholars believe, sometime between 1440 and 1450 in Italy. There were basically these pre-existing decks that had additional trump cards with allegorical illustrations added. So these were in addition to the traditional common four-suit pack of cards. Now, with these new decks, they were called Carte de Triomphe, or Triumph cards. And the additional cards were also known as Triomphe, which became trumps in English. And I actually took this information from the playing card book that was published in 2012 by Franco Pratesi. So the oldest surviving tarot deck, in case you're interested, is the Visconti Farza tarot. That was painted.
Sounds great.
It's amazing.
Yeah.
It's the more syllables, the more austere it sounds. Anyway, it was created in the mid 15th century in Milan. So that's where the records can go back to. But here's a little bit of interesting information. How do you think these tarot cards were produced back then?
Back then, I would imagine they were hand done or wood cut, or the printing press didn't come out until Henry VIII's reign in the late 1500s. So I would say, or early 1500s. So I would say wood cut or hand painted.
Yeah, they were predominantly hand painted.
Yeah.
Which makes the scarcity of these pre-existing decks make sense.
Yeah.
It's so hard to preserve something that was hand painted that were used as novelty toys, as playing cards. Because of this, the number of decks produced was very small, and it was only after the invention of the printing press, as you mentioned, that the mass production of these cards became possible. And because of that, the expansion of tarot suddenly just shot out from outside of Italy, going into France, going into Switzerland. And then also, of course, what happened with the Italian Wars was that more and more of these decks and other things from Italy managed to spread throughout Europe. That's taken from A Wicked Pack of Cards. That's a book published in 1996 by Decker, Depolis, and Dumais. So that's it. The original purpose of the cards were to play games, but then we had a shift, as we mentioned. What I want to talk about is what the shift went towards, which was cartomancy.
Mm-hmm. Bring it on.
Let's do cartomancy now, actually. Okay. So basically, cartomancy is just fortune telling using cards. With that said, that's a very simple explanation because cartomancy is also attributed to being able to manipulate events using particular card readings or using particular decks, and also a type of self-actualization, or perhaps you can even say type of self-imposed psychology or therapy, where people will read cards to have a better understanding of their own selves. There's a lot of different interpretations of it, but basically, I think the common definition is fortune-telling through cards.
Is that what you think it is?
Essentially. Now, I'm interested if you have a diverging point of view on that.
Oh, 100%.
Okay, let's get into this.
Let's bring it on. So I'm going to preface this by saying I am a huge Jungian. I 100% believe in archetypes. Mm-hmm. I think there is messages being, however you want to interpret it. I don't think there's right or wrong answer, but I think there is some universal connection that does send, we identify with archetypes. I believe Carl Jung. I believed in his theories. I was not a Freudian supporter. I should back up that I do have a background in psychology and counseling.
Just in case you're wondering.
In case you're wondering. So, and just again to go deeper with that, as a child youth worker back several years ago, I worked with a psychotherapist in equine assisted psychotherapy. Mm-hmm. So we worked with horses in therapy sessions with military personnel, with young adults, families, and it was very supported by Carl Jung's theories because the horse became an archetype. And so what would happen, there was no riding of the horses. We would go in the arena, there would be myself and the psychotherapist, because for safety reasons, it helps. You have two people. One's watching the client, one's watching the horse.
And the horse rides the client.
Yeah, that's right, 100%. It's all backwards, if it's upside down. So what would inevitably happen is the horse would start to become the person, I'm using air quotes, that the client was there to address, or the situation. So if there was a struggle with a bully at school, mm-hmm. or if they were struggling with a parent, so we would have this conversation about, well, your mom, aka the horse, when you walked away, walked in the other direction. Mm-hmm. And all we did was observe and give feedback to the client. And that's at the heart of archetype is. We never used the F word. We never used feelings. We never asked, how does that make you feel? It was 100% up to the client to say, this is either bunk or okay, this happens in real life every time, I'm at school or I'm at home or I'm out with my people from work. And I inevitably would have people be like, this is garbage, I don't believe in this, and within like 3 or 4 sessions they started to make connections. And that's how my link to the cards came, is because I totally believe in archetypes. I'm not saying the universe is like I think we kind of create our own destiny and our own synchronicity. So that's why I jokingly said, but half seriously said, these are synchronicity creators. Is that the cards that become whatever we pick, however order we pick them in, the idea is, what does that connection mean to you? And that's totally up to the person who's reading, like who's experiencing the cards.
Yeah, I think that's very important. There is a correlation happening that is dependent upon the viewer, upon the person who's having the reading performed for them. Yeah. And it's very interesting you brought up Jungian theory, because that's actually coming into play in the 20th century for the repopularization of tarot. But we'll get into that in just a little bit. I think what would be great right now, before we get into more history and more extrapolation over the more, I guess you could say, quasi-mystical side or esoteric side of the cards, let's do a reading.
You want to do a reading?
Let's actually talk about what sort of things happen during a reading, and maybe briefly touch upon what exactly major and minor arcana are, because that's a phrase relating to tarot, but I don't think a lot of people who are not familiar with it actually know what that means.
Yeah, no. So I'm going to suggest that we use, just because I'm still very new at this and you're a bit of a skeptic, and I 100% appreciate that. In a normal situation, the reason why I'm using the original Smith-Waite tarot deck for this is because when you get the variations, so the Stranger Things, the Halloween, and the Dog Tarot that I have in front of me, so the cups are something different. So in the dog, it's the bowls, and those are ones I'm still learning, but I feel more comfortable with the original because that's the deck I'm teaching myself with.
That actually would have been my preference anyhow,
okay,
so that's
we're
perfect.
So what we're going to do is I'm opening the box. Again, I am still learning, but there are 78 cards. There is the minor arcana, which is basically your playing deck suit, with your cups, your pentacles, your swords, and your wands. And the rest are the minor arcana, the major arcana, which basically are your emotions, the feelings that you have. So like the sun, the dreaded death card, which isn't as bad as people think it is. Those are things that you would interpret based on the image that you see, whereas the minor arcana are like the cups are associated with emotions. So if you pull anything related to a cup, it has to deal specifically with your emotions. Pentacles tend to deal with the earth and your connection to the earth. So it's typically like finances, something that is trying to keep you grounded.
So each one of these images or icons have a type of allegorical element to them.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah. So, and that's just the symbolism behind it. But how I do very little talking, and this is just something I've learned from people that have worked with me as I'm learning this, is the idea is I shuffle the deck, and the key is you don't shuffle them poker style. You don't do the two-handed flip, flip, flip.
Yeah.
You have to do them one by one, or like just little bits like you would originally do a traditional shuffling. And I don't really know the reasoning behind that, but that every time I've been told to shuffle, it's told don't do the flippies. Like don't do the hard shuffle.
I have a speculation here.
Okay.
Because the original tarot decks were hand painted, and that means the paint was a little bit more fragile. Perhaps that was just a custom that passed over to the use of the cards over years. Again, I can't substantiate this with anything. It's just a suspicion I have.
That seems legit to me. So, that makes the most sense. So I just want to make sure I got all the ones. Okay.
So Erica has shuffled the cards.
Yes, I have shuffled the cards. Now,
very lovingly, I should say.
The more, more because they're still new and I don't want to wreck them. Now, I will say you can get really in depth with this. There's a lot of talk around. Okay, if you drop a card, the face flips up as you're shuffling. Does that mean something? If the cards, if you pull a card upside down, everybody's different how they interpret those cards. I am still new to this, and again, the people that are teaching me this have basically said you can go as in depth as you want. I just turn them around right now. So it basically what that means is if you if you turn a card over and it's facing you, like it says 4 cups, for example, you would read it like that, as like this emotion, and you interpret the image. But if it's upside down, then it's the opposite of what you would initially think it is. But again, I'm new, I'm still learning, and again, people have mixed opinions on whether or not that really matters. So
okay, but we're not going to consider that at this point. This reading is going to be one of the more basic sort of readings, I guess you could do.
And Adam's very skeptical, so this should be interesting.
Will this impact my reading? According to what people say, that's what I guess my question actually is.
So my whole thing is, what I'm going to do is I'm going to lay them, sort of fan them out in front of you on the table right here in front of us. What I tell people is you can ask a question. So you have to ask the cards a question. You don't have to share it. Like, some people get really private, and I respect that, absolutely. The key with the question is it can't be a yes or no question. It cannot be easily answered with a yes or a no. You know, will I come into financial gain? Yes. Like, that's an easy, you have to do something a little more in depth. Again, you can share it, you can choose not to share it. I sometimes prefer people don't share it, because then after they pull the cards, then you kind of see things tweaking in their brain, and I let them lead the session.
So I have a question then, just kind of like going off the example you gave. It can't be a yes or no. So instead of asking, will I have financial gain? What if there's a question someone's posing? Let's just say someone goes, there's an investment I'm thinking about making. Ought I to make that investment? Instead of just being a yes or no, the cards kind of give perhaps different things to consider upon making a choice. It isn't just, will this happen or won't it happen? It's kind of laying out potential for you to consider. Okay.
So you could spin it as, looking at making a specific financial investment, how would that play out for me?
Okay.
And then interpret. But if you're like, should I make this financial investment, and it's a yes or no answer, that's really not going to get you further.
I'm thinking of selling all my Dogecoin. No, that's not actually what I'm considering.
So like a relationship question is, is this, I've just started a new relationship. How will this, or what is keeping me from moving forward in a relationship, or like something like in that realm, where you can kind of leave it open-ended, but it's not like, will this relationship work out, yes or no?
Not a leading question, more of an analytical question.
That's a good way of putting it. That's way better phrased. So again, you don't have to share your question.
I'm going to keep this internalized.
I sometimes prefer that, because I wait to see what happens. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to fan the cards out in front of Adam, and then I'm going to ask you to ask the cards. Again, you're going to keep it internal. Ask the cards the question, and then you're going to pick 3 cards. Doesn't matter how you pick them, but you need to pick 3 cards and put them in front of you. Okay.
So the cards have been fanned out in front of me. I'm taking a moment to articulate the question I'm asking inside my mind. So now I'm going to select 3 cards based off of that question I've articulated in my mind. And just to clarify, I just need to pull them in front of me face down.
You flip them over.
Flip them over.
Yeah.
Okay.
So you're going to pick a card and flip it over in front of you, and do that 3 times. Okay.
So just so the listeners to this understand what I've pulled, the 3 cards I have, they are the King of Wands.
So I'm going to,
Please go ahead.
Yeah, from left to right.
Left to right, yes.
Yes. And I'm going to note that you did pick them right or left to right.
Yes.
You did them in that order. So on the far left, we have the King of Wands. In the middle, we have Justice. And on the far right, we have the Tower. So my first question to you, Adam, is there any one of those cards that stands out for you?
Yes, there is.
Which one?
Justice.
Why?
Because my question I'm considering, I think, is an ethical question.
Okay. And so what about that card specifically? And when I'm referring to the card, the image in the card, is there anything, like, if you want to describe the image, is there anything in particular you identify with in the image? Anything that stands out for you in the image?
I think for me particularly, there's a robed figure holding a sword in a scale, traditional view of justice. This figure also has a crown and is sitting upon a sort of stone seat. I think there is a consideration, a contemplation that's not only on the character's face, but also through the use of symbolism of the scale and the sword depicting justice. That has appealed to me because, again, the nature of my internalized question is ethical.
Okay. And so that would be the one that stood out most for you.
I would say so, yes.
Okay. So that is your present. So the first card on the left is your past, middle card is your present, and the card on the right is the future.
Okay.
If you sort of want to interpret it that way. So what about the King of Wands? Is there anything in particular that stands out for you for that one?
I did feel, because again, as I said, and I'm leaving this ambiguous because I want to keep this as authentic to what you would normally do for a reading. I think there is also this interest of contemplation where the King of Wands has the staff within their hand. There's this sort of notion of power almost by being seated on this throne and having this large stick in their hand, but also there's a sense of, I guess you could say, generation, because you see these leaves also sprouting from this rod, which otherwise should not have leaves on it because it is removed from the earth.
Oh, very interesting detail that you stuck that out. And what about the tower? Is there anything in that image that stands out for you?
Quite a bit. So, of course, the tower, I think this is an image a lot of people are familiar with because it is used in a lot of movies, particularly horror movies when people perform tarot, which is another reason why it's very popularized right now. You have these figures either fleeing or being tossed out of a flaming tower with a lightning bolt striking it and a crown being thrown off. What's interesting is the two other cards both have crowns featured in their characters. So there's this sort of a removal of, I don't want to say authority, but some sort of rightness or order that's happening. And that's what I'm seeing with that.
Do you find it curious at all that all three that you pulled have crowns in them?
Yes.
Why?
Because it's a coincidence.
So close. So close.
But I'll wait for the Erica answer.
Okay. So I'm going to start with Justice, because it's your middle card.
Okay.
And that is, so again, the Justice and Tower cards are your major arcana. So these has to do with sort of how there's specific interpretations of, so in this card you would have the Empress, in this sort of deck you would have Empress, the Death card, the Hanging Man. Those all can sound terrible, but it very much depends on how you identify with those cards. So that's why the Death card is not the worst thing in the world, because, for example, the Death card symbolizes a change happening.
And I've even heard that before. It's about just a change or a shift, not necessarily death as in the big ending.
Yeah. So that's why those major arcanas interpret, it's how you identify with those cards. So the Justice card, and I am reading from my beginner manual because I am still learning. So for those out there, don't harsh my vibe too much.
Respect the vibes.
Yes. So this is from Easy Tarot Handbook by Josephine Ellershaw. This was my beginner one. So Justice is very much a card of balance. So this is your present card, remember. Though more of the rational, logical kind, using the intellectual mind rather than the emotional self. Which I'm going to say does describe you.
That definitely describes me. As anyone who's listened to this podcast before can verify, that definitely describes me.
I'm definitely going to... Yes, this describes you. A balanced mind will be required in order to come to a well-balanced decision that is fair and reasonable for all concerned. So, and it does go on from there, but I usually just read the first little bit. So to me, that's enough for you to
I think so.
interpret.
I'm very satisfied with that.
So we'll go to your past, which is the King of Wands. And since there is obviously a king in the image, that it's referred to as, these men are often found as entrepreneurs because they're always full of creative ideas and enthusiasm for their projects. They can, however, appear somewhat rash or impulsive in their decision making because they are not afraid to take risks. In whatever role you find them, they stand out for their dynamic ways, and they like to feel a sense of freedom in being able to go about their work without restraint. Due to their high energy level, they can be found in sport environments. They can also be found in sales positions or field positions when they are left to their own devices, so long as they perform, but anywhere they can channel their apparently endless energy without restraint. And then your future, which is the Tower card. A house that has been built without good foundations must collapse sooner or later. The tower represents such situations for anything that has been built on an illusion or false beliefs that is now coming to an end. In the positive, it means having the ability to see the truth in a matter and to build anew for the future, this time with solid foundations.
Ah, very interesting.
So that's the basics of what those 3 cards mean.
I want to thank you, first off, Erica, for doing that reading.
Oh, no problem.
I think that's a very good introduction for people who maybe have never experienced a tarot reading, the type of interpretation and process of it. Of course, before we get too much into the episode again, I do want to do a brief plug, because if you're interested in tarot reading, you can actually have an opportunity to see what it's like for free at Windsor Public Library.
Absolutely. So Vicki Frederick, who's been one of my tarot teachers, has kindly offered to run a program called Let's Talk Tarot. This is not a tarot reading. It's for people to come in and learn what the cards mean, to play with the cards, sort of just experience this. It's not meant to be anything scary or too witchy, quote unquote. It's very much a program of, let's just talk about tarot and what does it mean and what do these cards mean and how do we read them and what could that mean to people that are interpreting them.
Yeah, this is not a place to go for medical or for financial advice.
No, it's all fun. We kind of did an impromptu one in July, and it went over really well. So Vicki has kindly offered to do 3 sessions. So it'll be October 10th, November 14th, and December 12th. These are all Thursday nights from 6:30 to 8 at the Downtown Central Branch on the main floor. You don't need to register. You don't need your own tarot deck. We have plenty on hand. Just come on by and we'll just chat about tarot for an hour and a half.
Now, I do want to talk a little bit about interpretation of this.
Sure.
Because for me, I'm going to go into my cynical mind.
Of course, I would not expect anything less, Adam.
But I'm thinking there's that very famous thought experiment by Wittgenstein where there's an illustration where if you look at it a certain way, it appears to be a bird with a long bill, or if you look at it another way, it is a rabbit with long ears.
Yep. I know exactly what you're talking about.
Yep, and it's that whole notion of I am going into this seeing what I want to, and I'm not trying to debunk, I'm just curious your response to this. If I were to say, well, I did have an ethical question, which I kept inside, I do think these cards resonated to give an approximation of, not just an answer, but necessarily a sort of, I guess you could say, examination of this query, but that stuff's already in my mind. This is basically me making connections to considerations I've already made or I would make. How would you respond to that?
I think that's exactly it.
Okay.
I mean, I'm not going to sit here and pretend I'm not. I'm a skeptical believer about pretty much anything, quote unquote, paranormal. But I think that's the idea. So if I was a psychic telling you stuff and said this without cards, it's the same thing. You've already got this in your brain. And for some people, it's a matter of finding some direction and validation. And however you interpret this and walk out of here, the point is, it provided some thought. If you rely 100% on this to make life decisions, that's probably not, I'm going to be honest, that's probably not the best thing to do. But the idea is, could it create your own synchronicities? Could you manifest these connections that you've already sort of been contemplating? And this is the universe's way of saying, you know what, you are on the right direction, or here's some little validation because you picked the cards randomly. I just laid them out I literally just fan them out in front of you and you pick those cards. And that's where the conversation of what part of these things identify for you. And what I think doesn't matter. It's what you think.
I feel there's a truth in this because when you have breakthroughs in therapy, for example, oftentimes isn't because the therapist is telling you, this is your problem, this is what you need to do. Certainly there are types of therapy that do follow that route, but commonly the therapist is there to passively listen, to provide prompts for you to explore things that you need or you feel that you need to contemplate. And I feel that is, for the most part, effective therapy.
Yeah.
And I feel there is something therapeutic in this in terms of it being a type of self-exploration or self-examination.
Yeah, I think that's all it's meant. That's why I'm like, Dave, it's not scary.
Dave, you could have had your big questions answered. Now that we've done that, and once again, a very sincere thank you for
no
that.
problem.
It is fun.
Thanks for being a good sport about it, because I know we were kind of jostling each other before.
We were
this.
riffing one another, yeah. But let's get a little bit more into the history of this, because I think it gets very fascinating where this goes. We've established the original reason that tarot cards were created was to play games. And eventually what happened was rules were created for playing various games. There was a tarot-like deck that was given rules in a manuscript sometime before 1425. They're very vague descriptions of how to play the game and terminology that would later be adapted to the more type of, I guess you could say, cartomantic or fortune-telling aspects of the cards later on. But either way, this terminology developed until a complete description of rules for this game appeared in France in 1637. Now, by the 18th century, and this is where we see that jump, tarot's greatest revival really occurred, because during this time, it became one of the most popular card games in Europe. And this is not tarot in terms of cartomancy. This is tarot as in the original iteration of how to play the game. But because of its popularity and various printing presses, there were different suited decks appearing within different regions of Europe. So you had suits for Italian regions, for Spanish regions. You had French decks. You had a Portuguese suite system, and you had the unique German Tarot cards. So you had quite a bit of deviation in this. And then what happened was the application of it for occultism.
Yes, Satanic Panic.
Oh, yes. Going back all the way, can you believe it, to the 19th century? In the early 19th century, French occultists claimed that tarot cards had esoteric links to ancient Egypt and other things such as the Kabbalah, Indic Tantra, and the I Ching.
It's all imagery.
Exactly. As you said, there's archetypal imagery.
Yeah, it's all related to imagery, and that's essentially what this is. I mean, this is a stretch, and I will acknowledge that, but when you go to an art gallery and you have a reaction to a painting, the person next to you is like, I don't see the point at all. That's like, again, it's a stretch, but that's essentially what it's all about, your connection to the images. That's your experience.
Someone is going to look at a Jackson Pollock painting and see the kinetic frenziness of the 20th century, and someone else is going to see a bunch of blotches of paint on a canvas.
Exactly.
And neither one is invalid. Those are both your interpretations separately of what that is.
Absolutely.
What I find is interesting at this point, the claims that these cards have these ancient connections, they really came because there were so many variations of the cards, and there were so few similar suits amongst them. So eventually there were varying decks that were kind of made into what are standardized decks, and we used one of the most popular ones, of course.
Yes, we used one of the older, the one that has been around the longest, as far as in this sort of commercialized version of these tarot decks.
So the earliest evidence of a tarot deck actually being used for cartomancy, it comes from an anonymous manuscript in 1750, and it documents divinatory meanings for the cards. And this was taken from a book called The Playing Card by Dumais Michael in 2003. Basically, we had a single manuscript indicating this, based off of these cards and these variations of it erupting all throughout Europe. There was nothing substantiated this claim, but it was there. And then, by the 1780s, the tarot, esoteric tarot, I should say, blew up, especially because of Antoine Court and Jean-Baptiste Ouellette. These were two Parisians who, in the 1780s, made and popularized the esoteric tarot deck. Now, Ouellette was the first to actually produce a bespoke tarot deck, specifically designed for occult purposes, and that would have been around 1789. And so in keeping with the belief that such cards were derived from the Book of Thoth, this deck contained themes relating to ancient Egypt. So what happened is that a lot of people saw this bespoke deck with this imagery that was also very popular at the time, because Egyptology was really blossoming at that point in Europe, especially in the UK. And they pointed at this as a sign of its ancient roots. But meanwhile, this only occurred in 1789. Then we ended up with the standard 78 card tarot deck used by esotericists, and then, of course, with the major and minor arcana, which we explained. And what's also interesting, the terms that we described, minor and major arcana, were not used before this period of time, only by Jean-Baptiste Piteux. He was also known as Paul Christian, which was another name that he was anglicized with. And they were never used in relation to the original rules of the tarot card games.
Interesting. I didn't know that.
Yep. You can find that information actually in an article from the Encyclopedia Britannica. That article is written by David Parlett. It's simply Tarot Game is the article heading if you're looking for that. Just getting into more contemporary times, of course, we're seeing how this blew up into popularity in Italy and in France, but then it came over to the United States. And boy, did it blow up there. I mean, in addition to its popularity in Victorian England, in the States, it blew up even more exponentially. There was a book by Madame Camille Lenormand entitled Fortune Telling by Cards, or Cardomancy Made Easy. And that was published in 1872.
I was like, that's the original For Dummies book.
It truly is. And there was also an anonymous essay written by an American on the tarot published in the Platonist in 1885. And it was entitled simply The Tarot. Again, these talk about cardomancy, fortune-telling capabilities with the cards, linking it to ancient practices ranging from Kabbalah to ancient Egypt. Now, research conducted strongly suggests that this latter essay was written by an individual with connections to the occult order, the Hermetic Brotherhood of Luxor.
Okay.
So again, occultist.
Yep.
My mindset is, why would an occultist want to popularize the belief that you can use these cards for divination? What do you think?
Honestly, way to make money.
Absolutely. Let's go back to Mr. Crowley that we were talking about before.
I mean, like, whenever you present something to society that majority don't understand, yet you convince them it works, you're rolling in the money.
You are selling snake oil at that point,
100%.
and you're reaping the dividends from it.
Yes,
Much
absolutely.
like Crowley did with his practices, this guy did the same thing. Absolutely.
Yeah. Especially if you hit people where they're desperately looking for answers. Like, this is where, like, you know, the whole, you can speak to dead people. Someone who just desperately wants to talk to someone who, or connect with someone who has passed that's close to them. Unfortunately, people do take advantage of that. Mm-hmm. And if people don't really understand how these work, and that, you know, it's just, it's a mechanism. It's just something to try. It's not, don't base your whole life decisions on this, but it's something that you can connect with in some way.
When people say the universe is pointing at signs, what I find interesting is that I think when people hear that, the automatic response for a lot of cynics is to go, oh, there goes my BS alarm. But not necessarily, because I think people have different interpretations or ideas of what they even mean when they say a term like that. Yeah. And for some people, it's just, I am a practitioner of serendipity. I think just stumbling across things often has led me to paths in my life that I'm interested in.
Yep.
It's not because I believe some consciousness ordains my steps in my day to discover certain things, but it's just by discovering and allowing the chance for randomness to occur, my life becomes richer that way. And I wonder how much certain people using that type of phrase, saying I'm following where the universe is leading me. Yeah. I mean, is it woohoo, or is it actually someone just saying I'm opening my options?
Well, I think it does come back to like how open a person is, and especially when it comes to emotions. Mm-hmm. And there's a lot of, especially recently, research out there about related to hauntings and how is it really someone back from the dead, or just we emotionally charging the environment? Like stone tape theory, basically. Like, you know, the theory is stone takes on the energy of the time period in which it exists, and it just keeps releasing that energy. So why can't we be that stone and taking on the emotion and releasing it to the environment? So I think it sort of depends on how openly emotional people are when it comes to the quote-unquote paranormal or the unexplained.
No, I don't necessarily disagree with that. And I think even that theory that you talked about with ghost, as you know, I am a cynic, and my interpretation would be that the projection of these spirits of maybe like a deceased loved one are psychological projections, I think it's perfectly fine for someone to say maybe there's a physical manifestation of it, because I'd rather entertain that and say, let's do research on this and find out something, rather than just say, it's a floating full body apparition.
Yeah,
I'd rather
exactly.
like explore something that can be empirically deduced.
Yeah.
With that said, we're jumping forward late 20th century. Tarot makes another comeback due to the counterculture of the 1960s and 70s and the writings of Eden Gray. Now, are you familiar with Eden Gray?
I have heard the name. Yes.
Okay, so she was very noteworthy for popularizing and repopularizing tarot during the 60s and 70s, particularly from a book of hers called The Complete Guide to the Tarot. And it's actually noteworthy for being the first work to use the metaphor of the fool's journey and explain the meanings of the major arcana. So this work became so popular, it led to popularity of tarot card readings, of people interpreting the cards for various methods, and be kind of, I guess you could say, synonymous with New Age practitioning.
Right.
But it also had this rise of people who were approaching it, I want to say, in a more objective way. People who were taking notions such as Jungian theory or even Joseph Campbell on psychological archetypes and using that as a guide to really apply them to personal introspection and growth. And especially with the counterculture movement that was happening at that time, trying to get away from, I guess you could say, traditional hierarchical forms of authority, dictating your direction in life, to using this as a prompt to decide your own path in life.
Yeah. I think that's a very good way of putting it, is a prompt. As like I said, I wouldn't base major life decisions on pulling these cards, but if I was stuck on something, I would pull the cards for myself and just see if it provides a pathway forward. And it goes back to the ideas internally. I believe we all know what we need to do for ourselves, and call it intuition, call it, gut feel, whatever. Is the cards provide that sort of nudge to be like confirmation, synchronicity, whatever, to move forward in a situation where we may be stuck in life.
I want to bring up an analogy for this that I find is very interesting to end off the episode. I once had a friend of mine, and they were very secular. They didn't believe in anything. They were completely, I don't want to say agnostic, they were a complete atheist. But he confided in me one time, if he has difficulty making a decision, sometimes he opens up the Bible, which I found extremely confounding. And I said, why? And his explanation was very much akin to what we said. It's not that the word of God necessarily, for him and his interpretation, is going to open up on a passage which is going to provide him an answer. It's that through this text, he's going to have this type of introspection and analysis that is going to allow him to consider perhaps part of a decision that he never considered before. And I find that very much akin to this, or even practices with the I Ching. Now, with that said, we've explored the roots of tarot, and there's no substantiated mystical roots with it. If anything, the esoteric elements are obviously put forward by occultists who wanted to sell products, who wanted to come across as being more knowledgeable than others. And yet, even though there's no ancient art of tarot reading as is claimed, it's still a very interesting practice, and I find something that provides great entertainment and a prompt for personal introspection, which is honestly harmless fun. I will say, going through this, ultimately the art of tarot, the mystical art of tarot, is a fiction, but I think the art of tarot as a practice for self-exploration and introspection is nonfiction, in the way where, like any other practice you have, if it's used,
It goes back to the Jungian theory. They're archetypes, right? Like if you are into dream interpretation, why can't this be part of your interpretation of the world around you?
Yeah, you know what? I think you put it succinctly, and I don't think I need to say anything more to that. Erica, I think this has been a very insightful episode, and hopefully.
Okay, but before we go,
okay,
you don't have to share your question, but I'm wondering, did you get some answers? Did you get some direction?
I think, and this is where I'm going to say this, so all my fellow cynics out there, this has helped me make a decision.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
Not because I believe there's some mystical force out there that's directing me towards the right answer, but because this did prompt me towards a level of self-introspection
Okay.
But with that said, Dave will be here next episode and we'll talk about more mysterious things. Until then, I do want to encourage anyone who is interested in tarot to check out Windsor Public Library. We do have resources on the art of it. And as Erica mentioned, we will be having Let's Talk Tarot, occurring at the Central Library.
Yes, it'll be October 10th, November 14th, and December 12th from 6:30 to 8. And I will say, anybody who's interested, I mean, it's a bit of a thick read, but it's very thorough on the history of tarot. Is anything by Rachel Pollack. We have her books at the Windsor Public Library digitally and in hard copy. So that has been my quote-unquote Bible of learning tarot. And definitely a deep dive into the history of it and the meanings behind it. So again, don't be afraid to play around with it. I will get a new tarot deck and I literally will just play with the cards and kind of get to know them and understand them. Honestly, that's the hardest part, is remembering all 78 cards. So, but you learn as you go. And it's just something new to exercise that big muscle in our head.
It's fun. It's a harmless activity.
Yes.
Give it a shot. Hopefully, if you were a little apprehensive about it before, this may have swayed you on it. And for any of the historical documents that I referenced, you can either get those from Windsor Public Library, order them through our interlibrary loan system, or you can always find them digitally using our resources online. Erica, once again, thank you for joining us here.
I'm glad you sat in the middle on this one, because I was going to be kind of pissed if you went full
I felt like I was very far on the side, but you know what? Full stop. Mystical forces at play. Don't believe it. Does this actually help people in some capacity with making decisions? Positively, it can. And I will simply leave my opinion on that.
That's great. Thanks, Adam.
You're welcome. This has been Fiction or
Nonfiction.